Well, hello and welcome to Seattle City Makers. I'm your host, Jon Scholes. Well, hello from Chicago, everybody, where I've got the good fortune of being this week for the annual conference of the International Downtown Association. The 69-year-old organization is the trade association for those of us in the world of downtown advocacy and place management. And we're here this week for their terrific annual conference that I'm looking forward to. And we're meeting at the Palmer House, the 150-year-old incredible Chicago hotel, the longest operating hotel in the country. Burnt down just 13 days after its grand opening and reopened in 1873 and has been home to every U.S. president since Ulysses S. Grant, I understand, has stayed here. A number of world dignitaries and celebrities, just an incredible hotel. And again, the longest operating hotel in the United States, the Palmer House. And my guest for this episode is David Downey, the president and CEO of the International Downtown Association. David's responsible for the overall strategic positioning of IDA as a world leader and champion for vital and livable urban centers. Prior to joining IDA, David served as the managing director for the American Institute of Architects Urban Design Center and as executive director for the Michigan chapter of the American Planning Association. David's been a city advocate since the 1980s and received his degree in architecture and design with a focus on urban design. And he's just been a terrific leader of the International Downtown Association for many years now and really growing the relevance and the value that organization provides to groups like the Downtown Seattle Association and others around the U.S., Canada, and across the world, providing best practices and bringing us all together to compare notes and borrow and steal ideas from one another and bring them back to our downtowns and put them to work. And we've got a record number of attendees at this conference, IDA going on its 70th year of providing this type of content and convening to place managers from around the country. David and I discuss his perspective and take on the state of our downtowns and what's needed to continue to fuel their revitalization as we emerge from the pandemic, what's going well in certain downtowns and things that are inspiring David. We talk about some of the challenges and common threads that he's hearing from his members across the country and across the world. Get David's take on return to office and the future of the office and office to residential conversion, and some of IDA's recent work in Washington, D.C. to develop and make possible more federal incentives to support the revitalization and reinvestment in downtowns across the U.S. Hope you enjoy my conversation with David Downey, the president and CEO of the International Downtown Association. Thanks for making time for this.
Absolutely.
In your busy schedule of working with Chicago to host all of us here. Good to be in Chicago.
It is really good to be in Chicago.
Yeah,
and I'll tell you, the CLA team and my team have just been killing it. So I'm glad to take the time.
And you reported record attendees.
We have.
Record sponsorship for this year's
Absolutely.
conference.
There's a hunger and a desire to get together, as you know, with colleagues like yourselves, and to kind of share where are we going post-pandemic.
Remember when a couple of years ago, people said no one would ever come to these kinds of things again, these trade association events and gatherings, and we do this all virtually, and you've got, 1,500 folks?
Just about, and growing. We're still kind of in day one, so we know more will walk in the door.
What do you make of that, of downtown leaders from across the country, Canada, across the world, that they want to get together, and you've got better numbers than ever before?
There's a lot of conversation.
Are we all looking for therapy? And
there's always a little bit of commiseration.
Yeah.
But no, I think too, everyone's kind of settled into, we have a better idea of what's happening in our cities.
Mm-hmm.
Just about a year ago, it was still kind of emerging. Now I think people are getting a sense of what the challenges are. They've also taken on a lot of new talent in their own organizations who have gotten on their feet, but now need to really accelerate and get more learning, more education, build their own professional networks, and really do what this industry has always been great about, which is sharing experiences and best practices. And when you have 1,500 people that know exactly what you do each and every day, you jump right to solutions.
I've always said it's one of the great businesses to be in, or industries to be in, where you can freely steal other people's ideas and they don't really care, right? I mean, we're kind of competing with each other across the country or world, but in some ways not really. Everybody's sort of apt to help each other and share their knowledge.
It's part of what I've loved about the IDA community from day one, because you don't hold everything close to the vest because you think it's a competitive advantage. You're about building success in your area. And if any other downtown or neighborhood district can learn from that, you've all been so generous in sharing. You know this, we talk about R&D as rip off and duplicate.
Right.
But, we also talk a lot recently about how it's really not that simple. I think we kind of tongue-in-cheek call it R&D, but we also recognize that it's taking the concept, but then actually making it unique and contextualizing it when you get back home.
Yeah.
Because the same idea and project works a little differently in Seattle than it may work in Chicago. And that's the other thing you all are just so impressive about, customizing.
No, we all got our local politics and other issues that are unique and distinct, right? To take an idea from someplace that worked, but then how do you put it on the ground and a city with your own political dynamics or what have you.
Or expand that internationally when, we've got a contingent from Japan that comes in, and they can still talk about activations, and they do a lot of work in the Marunouchi district, but they're taking kind of North American ideas, and of course they've got to implement them differently.
Mm-hmm. Well, we look forward to hosting next year.
Oh, that's really exciting. Our 70th anniversary. It will be a milestone.
That's awesome
for the industry.
And I think you guys haven't been there for, 30 years. It was early 90s. The last time IDA was in Seattle. We've been fending you off, holding you off. You've been inviting yourselves, and we've said maybe next year. Maybe next year.
You all been very busy building a great city.
So a few things have changed since 93 or whenever that was.
Right.
But we look forward to having you, and we're going to try to beat Chicago's number.
I'm competitive. Of course you are.
I don't know if we're going to beat the weather. It's 80. It was 85 yesterday when we landed, and still 80 something today. Well, in early October.
I've told you, I think I'm a bit of an anomaly because I've actually, for all the times I've visited Seattle, it's never rained when I'm there.
There you go.
So
I think early September we're safe.
Okay.
I might guarantee that when I take the stage on Friday and invite everybody
that'd be cool.
to come. Have you seen our video?
I actually have not.
Oh, it's great. Our little, they call it a sizzle reel, right, James?
Right, exactly.
James helped produce that with our social media team. It's
very cool.
It's a great welcome to Seattle.
Well, the other thing that I'm hoping to do, leveraging the success that we're having here in Chicago, which actually is Illinois is where IDA started 69 years ago. And so in my head, it's a little bit of like a conceptual, respect and develop a strong history. We're at the Palmer House Hotel here in Chicago, which is a great historic landmark. And as we move into next year, it's like, okay, Seattle's a little bit of that, future of our cities, and can we leverage that storyline of being here to recognize where we started, and then a great city like Seattle to say, where's the future for the next 70 years.
It's going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah.
What are you hearing among your members, which are all different shapes and sizes in different parts of the country and world? What are some of the similarities in the challenges that folks are facing as we continue to emerge from the impacts of the pandemic? Is there sort of a through thread that is common among the members of IDA?
I think there's several, and none that you're surprised by. When we had a absence of people in our urban centers, especially those that were largely commercial districts, it's been slow to come out of the pandemic and to not re-inhabit, but to get a lot of street life activity, a lot of footfall across the sidewalks, really building that community, that energy. And with that, there's also been, a lot of perceptions about, lack of safety or security. If you had the same number of unhoused neighbors in your downtown, they're more visible. And I think people, are still trying to understand how they can help, how they can, recognize this imperative of trying to help people. But it's changed a little bit of that quality of life, if you will, for everybody. So I was really excited coming into Chicago this week. About 6 months ago, it was much quieter. It's starting to pick up. Even on a Monday, the sidewalks were more active. And I think that's a lot of the great work to say, how do we do more activations? How do we help bridge this back to work strategy that still is unfolding and uncertain? How do we look at adaptive reuse of underutilized spaces so that we can activate our communities? There's real estate components to it, but there's also ultimately a lot of the struggles of how do we make our spaces vibrant and active and inclusive. And that's everything that people are working across the board, whether you were an underperforming central business district that had very little residential, or you were strong residential mixed use that everyone's driving towards, but everyone was still kind of uncertain what they were going to do. So I think that's more of the common thread through it all.
In the West, our West Coast downtowns certainly feel the effects of homelessness and the fentanyl crisis. And I think there's maybe an attitude of, we're the only ones dealing with that. And, the Seattles and San Franciscos and Portland's and LA. But I know from talking to colleagues around the country that they're dealing with those issues as well. And I mean, is that your sense of, whether you're in Tempe or Seattle or New York, you're facing, the breakdown of systems to help those that are on the street, the breakdown in public safety systems, and then this drug crisis that has really descended, certainly on our West Coast downtowns.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, we know people are suffering everywhere, and we know the systems are strained just about everywhere. I think it's going to actually get a little bit worse unless we can all find new solutions to come together collaboratively. There won't be a silver bullet. It's going to take partnerships, as you know. That's kind of the bread and butter of our industry is who do we bring around the table? How does everyone step up in their own ways in a coordinated way and really address whatever the challenges may be? And the fentanyl crisis, the unhoused, just the challenges that we're facing in mental health. There is no one entity that can solve that alone.
Are there efforts of downtown organizations within your membership that have inspired you over the last year stand out? You all do a great job of recognizing in awards that you'll hand out later this week to different organizations. But as you think of your membership, are there efforts around revitalization and recovery of different organizations that particularly stand out?
Oh, you're asking me to think about the ones that are simply top of mind right now because there's just so many. But I think to an organization, and then not one in particular, the growth of these multidisciplinary response teams have really been inspiring to me. When we think about the issues that we're having within public space, within our streets, within homeless, fentanyl, everything you just described, I think the toughest thing is our organizations are a very small piece of the entire city when it really comes down to it. They may operate inside of less than 3% of the landmass. Your budgets are less than 1% of that of the entire municipality.
Right.
You're bridging the gap between that public sector and private sector and engaging the civic, philanthropic sector. So how do you fit into an extremely complex issue like mental health? And the growth over the last almost 2 years, I would say, of organizations that are bringing together their ambassador teams, bringing on outreach coordinators, and then bringing a member of their safety teams together in these response programs where rather than picking up the phone and calling PD, someone's in crisis, we can deploy these interdisciplinary teams to really start to understand what is a necessary response, freeing up PD for what they need to do, but also being much more, I always come back to it's almost a much more humane, interactive approach to say we have a citizen in our city that needs help, and we've found a way to coordinate across different agencies and find a solution for that. It's growing in cities, West Coast, East Coast, you name it. This concept of coordinated response is really helping, I think.
And it's certainly been one of the inherent strengths of downtown organizations and district organizations of having feet on the ground, right? Of having people out there already, of ambassadors and other functions to know what's going on, and we've to then be able to deploy that.
It's incredible. Your however many square blocks better than anybody. to a person. And we saw that in the pandemic when businesses were, there's federal funding to try and help, stem this pandemic. You were the ones that had the direct contacts. You had the director, if you will, of the outreach systems where you could communicate directly with them. And you're also able to pivot, on a dime and say, now we need to provide small business service support. That dynamic, I think, is another hallmark to the industry, because you just do it so well, so nimble, and it's about, getting things done directly.
And the idea of an alternative response to police and law enforcement isn't really a new idea. It's been funded by the private sector for some time through ambassador programs and outreach and other things. Getting it connected to the other systems is the challenge, right? Because you can only do so much in that model.
And again, going back to kind of our rip off and duplicate, those other systems and those other players vary from city to city.
Right.
And again, you're going to know those internal workings better than anybody.
So as we continue to emerge from the pandemic, this might be oversimplifying it, but it seems like there's sort of two schools of thought out there in, the space that we occupy and kind of the debate around the future of downtowns and urban places. One school of thought is they need to be completely reinvented. The pandemic has changed so much, the use of the office and other things. We need reinvention mindset. And maybe the other school of thought, to oversimplify, is no, we just need to recommit. And we need recommitment from the public sector. We need a recommitment from the private sector. But the core sort of ingredients and fundamentals in the way we've done business in downtowns that have made them over a long period of time desirable places, that still holds. Where do you fall in that maybe oversimplified perspective of the idea of reinvention or recommitment?
Can I pick the middle?
Straight down the middle.
Well, it's interesting because, when we start thinking about resiliency, and when we think about, great community building, at the end of the day, for me, it still comes back to, mixed use, dense urban environments that can provide opportunity for every type of person at every level. And I know that sounds utopian, but at the end of the day, that's what I think we're all striving towards. And we saw those that had been becoming more mixed use throughout the last several decades tended to do weather the storm much better. So we know, just like, financial terms, diversity works, diversifying the portfolio of your downtown is going to be of benefit. It'll be different for everyone, but I think on the idea of whether it's recommitment or reimagining the future, I do think we're at a point where we need to be bold. And so if we're looking at, say, action plans for rebounding or recovery, that's where I think in a lot of ways it's both. Maybe it's both, recommitting to the center city, the heart of the entire region, the strength both economically and culturally as a community to double down on your center city and your downtowns. Even if you're a small rural town, it's still that core where you celebrate, where you mourn, where you protest, but also where you drive, opportunity and success for everybody. So recommitting to that, as opposed to, well, now we can do everything from everywhere. I don't think that will be sustainable, and we know it has always been costly. But at the end of the day, there's still some very fundamental things that we know how to build great cities and great communities, and I would say communities and cities have always evolved. They evolve over 5, 10, 15-year time periods, and they will continue to evolve. And we know the more mixed use and diverse and vibrant, the more successful. Maybe there are some very things we have to re-envision that say, how do we get through this short term while we begin to really invest in that midterm? And maybe that's where the dynamic for me lies, is let's be bold in the next couple of years. We know the financial markets are tougher than they were. We know commercial real estate's going through some ebbs and flows. This is a time to try and accelerate, through incentives of a whole variety. That say, it will take a while for a new project to come out of the ground or adaptive reuse to take place. What are we doing for that really moves the market quicker And then while that's underway, what are we doing boldly tomorrow that can start to really create more vibrancy in our city centers?
Do you think the pandemic changed the preferences generally of the market and consumers that existed pre-pandemic? We saw this big, flight to the cities and people that wanted to work in cities, live in cities, be urban, play urban. And then again, during the pandemic, a lot of predictions of, we're going to spread ourselves out forever. We don't need that. We can Zoom in, we can be virtual. Where do you come down on sort of how our preferences have changed post-pandemic?
I don't think there's been a change, quite frankly. I think, especially I'll look at my own, I have a 25-year-old son who, moved into the city, loves the city. That's what he wants to do. His job ended up in the suburbs that he just changed, but he's not moving there because he wants to stay where he is. And we know Gen Z, by and large, has that same desire for that mixed-use, urban, exciting way of life. What we may have seen that coincided with the pandemic, I think in part was the natural progression of, a generation that was coming into family and children and maybe looking for an alternative and just happened to hit at the same time. But I don't think there was the mass exodus as grand as everyone was reading in the news. I think when you get into the data, even if it's an 80-20 question, and there's a 20% shift in the demand, that's an opportunity. How can we solve some of our other urban challenges by addressing, this opportunity of 20%, change, because the market's going to come back and accelerate beyond where it was, I believe.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of offices and future work and return to work, where do you come down on what the role of the office looks like a year or so from now, from your vantage point and talking to people around the country, around the world in downtowns?
So I think it varies around the world. But if I think more specifically to North America and kind of the development construct that we have here, I fall back to that 80-20. I think 80% of the market will come back as it was. The workplace will come back at 80%, however you want to define that as, 4 days out of 5 in office or some flexibility across a month that, really lends itself for successful hybrid environments. I think that's here to stay. I think quality of life and an opportunity to not be tied to a specific space for particular types of work is reality, and we've basically proven the concept, right? But I think we also are going to see, and probably my biggest fear is if we don't begin to really bring people back together, that we'll almost have a reduction in kind of talent. We can get away with being remote for several years, but everything that you and I had to learn on the job, so to speak, because it was relationship building, because it was understanding how work gets done in a collaborative way, because it was having access to mentors that were right there, allowed us in many ways to still be able to operate today in a virtual environment because we already had that kind of foundation built. I think the knowledge worker can do a lot of things remotely because it's more technology based. But then when you start looking at those, softer skills or those collaborative skills that are really to an individual person based, I think if we don't come back and start to build that capacity, that as an overall economy, we're probably going to slip a little bit because we won't know how to, come together and work, in group as people and really leverage that kind of innovation that happens just by having a conversation and a coffee and realizing, oh, I didn't know about that, but I can see where that's going to work. And so I think there's actually an imperative that we get back to some degree face-to-face in the office. And I've seen it in my own team where, esprit de corps and collaboration and that team bonding has dramatically changed since we've gotten back into the office. But again, I don't think it's going to be 100% 5 days a week.
Yeah, it's almost as if we've had this debate or conversation about return to office as if the workforce was static and fixed, and forgetting that there's people that are exiting it and then there's people coming in.
Yeah.
And so the preferences and choices of that, of the overall workforce are going to evolve because you've got new people in it that may not want to work virtually for their first job or, their first part of their career, but they want to get in and make those relationships. And then that drives a bunch of behaviors and other responses in an organization of, well, because if they're there, then some of the other people need to be there to deliver that value, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And also, too, some are finding it as a strategic way of that work-life balance.
Yeah.
Because if I need to go into if I'm going into work to do, the work that I'm passionate about, but then when I go home, I can also then have, my personal life or my family life. That builds in some of that separation that everyone's striving for, especially in North America, where what is work-life balance? What does that mean to you? What is it to, just enjoy life? And as we learn from kind of the Nordic regions, do you live to work or do you work to live? And I hope we were working towards the prior.
What are some of the differences that you see from the U.S. to other markets around the world on return to office?
I think what was fascinating for me is speaking with our colleagues in Germany who said very quickly they were all back in the office. But that's where I talked kind of a little about the North American context for how we develop, because Tine was saying, well, everyone lives in much smaller flats. They don't have that home office space, or they want to get out of their of their flat, and so the office was that environment to get back out and be part of community. And so I think that's where we see a little bit of difference too, is the nature of how we've built all of our communities here in North America, which has been generous. I think we know can also be costly. But across the world, we also see where different cultures, different economies, and different kind of building structures or community building structures really drive alternatives in how people,
and certainly
returning to office.
Different types of commutes seem to be a huge factor in people's willingness, ability, desire to be back in the office more often than not.
Yeah, definitely. And I think we can also probably, I'm just thinking out loud with you right now, John, but what happens in major metros is going to be different than mid-sized cities, is going to be different than small towns, because our time commuting is precious. And when it gets extremely long, then maybe some of more innovation and change may be occurring.
So IDA's recently gotten active at the federal level and trying to push some legislation, specifically some federal incentives to allow for an easier conversion of office to residential.
Right.
What's the status of that legislation? I know it's evolved a bit over the last year. It was first referred to as a Downtown Revitalization Act, and now includes some other types of geographies that would benefit from similar types of tax incentives. But what's the current status, and what do you see around office to residential in markets in the U.S.? How big of a move do you think that will be if this legislation is to pass?
I'm smirking. I'm sorry, because we just lost a Speaker of the House, so I'm not sure what the current status.
I was going to ask you, is there any bill? Yeah, but you've been able to get both Republican and Democrats around this thing, and the prospects, at least several weeks ago.
Yeah, absolutely.
From,
so
their lobbyists seemed to be somewhat bright, but yeah, things have changed in DC in recent days.
Yeah, and a once in a lifetime change as well. So I think we have to wait and see how it unfolds. But you're absolutely right. We've made some great progress, and really with the support of a lot of our members who are weighing into federal public policy in a lot of ways for the first time. As you know, in the last Congress, it was called the Downtown Revitalizations Act. It was modeled after historic preservation tax credits, and it looked to try and incentivize that more rapid adaptive reuse of typically buildings that were older than 25 years, underutilized and in need of adaptive reuse. It's not a silver bullet, but for anywhere from 5 to 15% of the building stock in any given city that is in that 1980s, 1990s kind of era, how do we accelerate the incentive to get those to flip? So there were a number of things that transpired last year, and since that time, we are now both Republican and Democratic representatives and senators who are taking a new look at that for the current Congress. Still very much modeled after the idea of a 20% tax credit associated with adaptive reuse, but now for not just office, but other types of buildings, also not just in downtown, but building stock throughout the city. So we're excited about that. It looks like we'll have a bill. Well, we know there's a bill that's in draft form. We were hoping for it to have been dropped this week. I don't expect that to happen, but we're still hopeful for the weeks ahead. And we're also starting to see some new thinking added to it. So not just mixed use with a 20%, affordable housing component to it, but maybe there's another alternative for a missing middle housing component built into it. Ultimately, we have to wait and see, what the representatives and the senators choose to go with. But we're excited because we think there's strong opportunity.
And this is really kind of one of the first major moves for IDA at the federal level to get more active on behalf of your members in the U.S. You've got a program in Canada that's been in existence for some time of organizing advocacy efforts up there. But where do you go from here in sort of focusing IDA's voice on behalf of its U.S. members in D.C.? What other opportunities do you see to get the federal government more involved, invested in the revitalization of our downtowns?
Sure. So in addition to this, adaptive reuse incentive legislation, we're already supporting, additional funding for our partners that are continuing to work to address homelessness. So we don't have to lead or be a key leader in a coalition on every topic. We can also bring our support and our experience, quite frankly, as to what happens with those boots on the ground to help inform. This is why continued funding for homeless assistance grants is such a priority. Likewise, on the public safety side, we're strong supporters of the burn JAG funding, which we really like because it builds in those creative and alternative ways of addressing the safety and security in our urban environments.
Alternative to policing, law enforcement.
Exactly. We've got, new initiatives, Madison, Wisconsin, in partnership with the city, the downtown organization, and the university. They're looking at, how can we develop a more effective program, the details of which I'll leave to them to share. But, they're working together with Burn JAG funding to try and look at how to innovate in public safety. And that, to me, is a great role for the federal government to play. That says things happen differently in different places. Your city's best. Your partner's best. We can support by providing some resource, but let you figure out the best way to do it.
And we certainly need the federal government at the table and invested, I think, more so in our downtown. So kudos and credit to IDA for helping to lead the charge there. And you're right, you don't have to lead it all. There's lots of organizations where we've got alignment that have a presence in DC that we can come alongside and bring our own perspective and expertise.
Well, and I'll give you a shout out too, because it was your work at the local level and over years as an advocate in Seattle that also said there is an important role for our industry and our professionals to step in and continue their leadership role, not just locally, but now how does that reflect to national public policy? I designed, my kind of strategy long-term to recognize, state and federal public policy were both on the table. Much of what our members are impacted by typically happens at their own individual state or provincial level in Canada. But it was my own board of directors that said, we'll grow into the state level and address that as we need to, but we really need that federal public policy voice. And that's where we want to step up. And step up you all have.
Yeah, big opportunities there for sure. We have a couple standard questions on our podcast. One is your first job that you drew a paycheck for, like a real legitimate paycheck, not cash under the table, but a paycheck.
I never got cash under the table. I mean, the very first job, literally at 9 years old, I was a caddy. So I caddied and worked at an area country club for 9 years between the ages of 9 and 18. But if we're talking about, After graduating, then it was with Oakland County Development and Planning, and I was doing some of the urban design work in the older first ring suburbs of Detroit.
Were you carrying a full bag at 9?
I was,
yeah,
as a matter of fact, and then later, 2 at a time. So.
And did you play the game at that age too?
I was, well, I would say I swung a club. I don't know that I was playing really well, but I definitely found a passion for it. Yeah. And except for interim years of my family and growing, sons and coaching other sports, it's been a passion, lifetime passion, and now I'm back to it. Enjoy it greatly.
Are there any lessons learned from 9 years as a caddy that you carry forward into your job today? Are there some nuggets?
You didn't give me the heads up on the script on this one. So, but yeah, I'll say, it is about relationships and it's about integrity and respect. I mean, the game of golf, for those that know it, you got to call your own penalties on yourself. Mm-hmm. So I think the sport itself is also kind of an individual sport. So it really focuses on what you can and can't do. And it's also, as we say, it's a game that can never be won, but always played. And so you continually go through and do your best each and every day. Things change, the environments change, your positioning changes, and you just continue to evolve and adapt. And I hadn't really thought about it in that regard, but that's a little bit about the work that we do. Integrity, relationships, adapting.
Yeah, I like that. It's it's a game that teaches us a lot and drives us nuts.
It absolutely does.
But we keep coming back, those that love it, I guess, right? We keep coming back to it. And our second question, and we modify this for our guests that don't have roots in Seattle, but I know you visited the city a number of times and you'll be there next September, if not before. But the standard question is, what's your perfect itinerary in the city of Seattle for a Saturday? What's your perfect Saturday? And we modify it for guests that from out of state to, what's your favorite city that you visited, and what are you doing when you land?
So I love many cities. I don't know that I absolutely have a favorite city, because especially with all of my members, they've all got great cities. I will say though, my favorite cities that I visit is when I get to see them through the eyes of people like yourself. So I think my favorite Saturday in any city would be, being fortunate to be able to walk throughout a neighborhood or throughout a city with our own IDA member, because you will inherently teach me things and illustrate things that as a general consumer, I may not have recognized. I had a great experience because we were in New York City for our Emerging Leader Fellows program. I got a chance to go down into Lower Manhattan, and the Downtown Alliance groups, Josh and Jessica, they were able to kind of give me a tour of their district. And they may not have realized it while that we were talking more of shop. I was learning about the history and the assets and the strengths and the evolutions of Lower Manhattan. It was like a little bit of going back to school, but then also finding those super special little niche areas that, if I was lucky enough to stumble upon, I might have found. But because I got to see the district through their eyes, the good, the bad, and the ugly, it was an extraordinary experience. So I think my perfect Saturday would be something akin to that. And as a matter of fact, it wasn't a Saturday, but I had a very long layover in Seattle several years ago, and our good friend Kate Jonkus, met up with me, and we walked the city a little bit, and seeing it, of course, through her eyes was pretty spectacular.
Yeah, you have a good perk to be able to, go to all these different places and get some of the best tour guides and experts to walk alongside and absorb from.
Very fortunate in that regard. There are so many cities that I do love. I will say I do have a little bit of an attachment to Edinburgh that I had never been to and have only seen a couple of occasions. And there's something about just kind of, I don't know if it's the ghosts, if it's the texture. Scotch could be part of it too. But seeing how that place transforms is also pretty spectacular when they go through their August festivals and the tattoo. up at the top of the mile in the castle, where they completely rebuild, an entire stadium for a month, and then pull it down.
Mm-hmm.
And at the bottom of the mile is their own parliament, and it's probably one of the most contemporary buildings sitting inside of one of the most ancient cities. And just some of that is special. But I can say similar things about just about every city that I get a chance to visit.
Yeah. Well, it's good to be here in Chicago with you, and thanks again for making time in a busy schedule and hosting everybody and pulling this conference together. I'm looking forward to it, and again, we're looking forward to having you all in Seattle in early September, and encouraging all of our Seattle listeners that have some affiliation with their own trade association to bring them to Seattle.
Absolutely,
this is our own little way of fueling some economic development to bring our colleagues to town. So we're going to be glad to have you all there.
Well, and one of the things that we're excited about and why we're here in Chicago is, going back to some of our very first questions, what's your perception of downtown? And it wasn't too long ago that headlines of, no, don't go to Chicago, or the crime is bad, or it's not a great city, kind of lit a fire under us as an industry to say, well, what if we decide that we'll go to Chicago for our annual event? Let's see how many passionate urban professionals would choose to be here. And the fact that they came out in record numbers tells me that we all know that Chicago is one of our North American great cities, and then likewise Seattle will be the same.
Yeah.
So we try and show up to also highlight and demonstrate that cities are great places, that they're the hearts of our communities, hearts of our economics, and I'm really looking forward to Seattle. So thank you for all the great work that you've been doing there, and that of the organization. And as a leader inside of IDA, you've helped us all greatly. Well, we look forward to showing off the good and some of the things we're still working on. So that's where we learn. We'll see you in Seattle in September. Fantastic. Thanks, David. Absolutely. Thanks, Jon. Well, hope you enjoyed my conversation with David. Thanks to him for making time in a busy schedule of playing host to a bunch of his members for a great conference. I'm back in Seattle now, and we had a great time in Chicago. Terrific city. Love the Windy City. We had a little bit of everything. Weather-wise, it was 85 when we landed and got some rain, and 50 or so when we left. But a good time. Got to see some live music at one of my favorite local clubs on the north side there, Shuba's. So that was a lot of fun getting out, and just great connecting and trading stories and ideas and best practices with friends and colleagues from downtowns across the country and across the world. And we are looking forward here in Seattle of hosting the International Downtown Association's 70th annual conference in September of next year, September 2024. We'll be inviting 1,000 plus of our friends and colleagues to come see what we got going on in our downtown and showing them Seattle. We haven't had the conference here since the early 90s, so a few things have changed, and we've got a lot to show off and be proud of. So we're looking forward as the Downtown Seattle Association to play and host. I want to close out with a recommendation of what you just can't miss in downtown Seattle. I want to highlight the Seattle Glass Experience, known as Refract. It's in its 5th year, celebrating Seattle's leading designers in glass design and glass blowing. The glass blowing community here in Seattle, which runs wide and deep, will be gathering to kick off this conference and experience with an opening night party over there at Chuli Garden and Glass, and a bunch of programming in glass studios throughout the city over the course of a couple days. You can go to refractseattle.org for more information and tickets. But this is a really cool event that's, again, fairly new, just in its 5th year, and bringing together glass designers and others with passion around glass blowing and glass design in our city. And speaking of Chuli Garden and Glass, if you haven't checked out the new bar at Chuli Garden and Glass, it was sort of an upgrade or change on what was there originally, the cafe, but it's supposed to be the new kind of happening spot over there in the north end of town on the Seattle Center campus. And now that the Kraken are back on the ice, a good pre-Kraken game place to go hang out and get a cocktail and check out, I think, 25 pieces in that space alone from Dale Chuli. So check out the bar at Chuli Garden and Glass. Thanks, everybody, for joining us on this episode of Seattle City Makers. A special thanks to our producer, James Cito, who lugged the mics and the heavy mic stands across the country from Seattle to Chicago so we could record this conversation with David. And Seattle City Makers is presented by the Downtown Seattle Association with support from James Cito and production by Spark Creative.